Welcome. Today we're going to get the chance to travel back in time and to pick an ancient person full of wisdom, we hope, from the ancient world who could advise us around what the good life would look like. We're going to get to sit on Plato's couch. Imagine that he's our kind of psychotherapist to drag our poor, sorry souls into a better life. And us poor moderns, how can we possibly live a better life? What would Plato say? What would his diagnosis of our problems be? How might he suggest some solutions? Okay, so let's first establish that Plato, like a good therapist, might use something called the Socratic method, Socrates being Plato's kind of mentor. And the Socratic method is basically where you ask well-crafted questions to lead the person into greater insight. They come to see it, hopefully, for themselves. But I'm sure Plato would want to give us plenty of information that we probably lack in order to do that as well. So, what would his central diagnosis be of our problems as modern people? I think what he would say is probably something that, he would have said to people in his own time in many regards, that we are often distracted by the material world. We're caught up in the multiplicity of things, and we don't really see the reality of the cosmos and of the metaphysical reality, the kind of spiritual reality that goes beyond the beyond the material world. And so we don't understand really also who we are, because we don't understand what we're in. So the central diagnosis I think he'd give is along those lines. We don't understand who we are, we don't understand what we're part of. And the third part would be that he would say we don't really orientate ourselves towards what he would call the good. This means basically that we live a disordered life. We don't live necessarily a virtuous life. We're stuck here in the material world in bodies, and Plato tends to see us kind of as imprisoned souls. And so therefore we are in constant conflict with the desires of the body and get pulled into what the body wants, and therefore we're distracted and pulled away from where the soul should be pointing. So he would probably start us off with explaining his schema of reality, and I've drawn this out in a very crude form for you on my illustrious whiteboard, which I'm just going to show you. I've got a bit of reflection from the windows, but I'll try and do my best to keep it fairly clear. So if you can see at the top there, you've got the one, or the good, and this for Platonists and Neoplatonists is the kind of originating cause of all being. Okay, I won't necessarily need to dwell there too much. And then descending from the one, you have what he calls the forms, the higher forms. So these are kind of like ideas. I won't get into the whole philosophy of that because that'll be a bit of a distraction, but basically kind of saying that the world as we see it in particular manifestations. Like I can see the circularity of my mug. I always get to bring my mug into this in some way. It always seems to come into every video. So I can see the circularity of my mug. I can see also maybe circularity of my marker pen, etc. But these are particular instances of circles, whereas the greater reality is that there's this idea of circularity. What I'm trying to illustrate here very badly is that the kind of material world only reflects in a shadowy form a greater kind of mental world of ideas that inform and that shape the material world. But that's not our focus here today, so I won't dwell on that too much. But basically, you've got a kind of an intellectual, and that's not necessarily in the modern sense of the word, but a kind of a mental field of reality that informs the lower reality we're going to talk about down here in a second. But this all descends from the good, the one, which is the source of all kind of being, beauty, goodness, and the forms that we see in the world reflected in a kind of shadowy form. What's important to understand before we get into all of this stuff is that up here, the higher up you go in Plato's hierarchy, the more real you're looking at things. So this world is more real than the material world in which we are ensconced. Okay, so this is sort of ultimate being, and you can see I've got this down the side here. Being descends down into the world of becoming, and then down into the world of non-being. And matter for Platonists is almost like non-being. It's teetering on the edges of reality. So in Plato's schema of things, the mental, the spiritual, if you like, the psychic, if you like, in some ways, is more substantive. It's the real reality of which the material world is, in a sense, a shadow. And so you get a kind of pattern as well where you've got, this is the really real good, and we descend down as we go into the world of matter and the world of many things. Not, I put the word evil here, but I don't mean it in a kind of whoa kind of way, but just kind of like you're getting into this idea of the privation of the good. Things are less real, less centered in real substantive being, and you're descending into the shadowy world of matter. It's kind of opposite often of the way modern people see the world. We often see the physical world, the material world, as the real thing, and kind of spiritual things as ethereal. But for Plato, it's the other way around, really. What we're looking at here is just a shadowy reflection of what's ultimate and good. And so you're descending down into what has less of this is therefore more kind of evil, if you like, bad, less good. Okay, so where the human soul is we are located in this scheme of things. Put that around a bit so you can see it. We're kind of located across this field. All right, so the intellect and the human reason is the highest part of the human soul. So Plato divides the soul, we'll look at this in a minute, into what he kind of sees is a conflict, really. He sees the soul as a simple unity in parts of his work, but he also sees it as tripartite in other parts of his work. So by tripartite, it means it's kind of three parts to it. And the highest part of the human soul is the rational faculty, okay? The ability to reason, the ability to look at our lives in the long term and to be orientated towards what makes sense, what is heading towards the good. So what we should be doing, for Plato's view, is we should be orientating our life back up in this direction towards contemplating the beauty, truth, being of the world, and the greater reality of which we are a part, and that we are kind of then putting reason in charge of the rest of the soul. But the rest of the soul for Plato is, you've got the kind of emotional part of the soul, and emotion, we'll talk about that again in a minute, is higher than appetite. Appetite is just simply kind of like I guess in later language we might use the word lusts, the kind of hunger, desire for sex, bodily needs. Okay, but here we're descended into desires which are more ensconced in the world of the senses and the material. And Plato's quite opposed to our kind of modern empirical approach to the world, where we would put a high value on sensory data. And he would say, actually, well, sensory data is a lower form of knowing things. Sense data, our five senses, if you like, they don't really help us make sense of the world. Just raw sensory data doesn't give you much understanding of reality. To understand reality, we have to make sense of things using the intellect. Okay, so you can see here he's got a very clear kind of orientation towards higher and lower parts of the soul, and that is related to where we sit in the schema of reality, how close we are to being in touch with the one and the good, compared to being ensconced in merely material concerns in the world of the senses. For Plato, we are, we're stuck in a sense in the world of the senses, but our true nature, our true essence, if you like, is the soul, and we should be concerned with the higher things more than with the lower things. Okay, so there you go. You've got a basic schema of very crude schema of Plato's thinking where the soul sits in reality. Now, next thing I want to look at is really kind of how this plays out in his psychology a bit more. So you can see I've got this, how can I put this so you can see it really well? I'll just hold it there for a minute. Okay, so you can see at the top, I've got unity, the one, okay, the eternal ground, the eternal good, and that is seen as changeless. It doesn't alter, right? So but the material and the sensory world is always subject to change. And Plato would say, look, you don't want to be orientating your world and grounding the way you live your life on the sensory material world that's always changing, that's always in flux. Think of Heraclitus here, earlier philosophers. You want to be orientating your world and your mind and your nature and your life towards what is a unity and the good, what is eternal, what is changeless. Okay, because he sees actually the soul in its higher levels is closest to this part, and this is the part that should be in charge, if you like. Okay, so I've got here two sides. So on the good side, what this means for Plato is he says, look, our capacity to reason, and by reason he doesn't just mean logic, he means kind of the ability to look at life in the longer run in terms of what's good for us, to be able to think through and understand ourselves and understand the world in terms of how we're connected to the good and the one and what is changeless. And we should be putting this part of ourselves in charge, living the virtuous life, orientated towards the good. And this should be the leading faculty in the human psyche. The next aspect is the emotion, or the heart, if you like human desires and emotions at that level are fairly good, but as long as they're under the control of reason. And then the same for appetite. Appetite is the lowest part of the human soul for Plato, and it's not necessarily bad, but it tends towards being focused on the sensory world, matter, multiplicity, getting distracted into this, that, and the other things that it needs. But that direction, going in this direction, can't lead us towards satisfaction. What we need to be doing is putting appetite in its place and keeping it under the control of reason and alongside emotion. Okay, and Plato uses a metaphor of something called the metaphor of the chariot. So he sees reason almost as this chariot driver trying to direct the course of the chariot, pulled along by two horses. One is kind of like emotion, if you like, and the other is appetite. And appetite is the more deaf of the two horses. You kind of see them as talking horses, but kind of weird. But anyway, okay. So reason needs to be in charge, and these two horses will constantly be trying to pull the charioteer off course. If they're left to run the show, the charioteer is going to crash and basically live a badly ordered life and go off course. And that's what you see over here on this side. If appetite and emotion are in control, reason is subject. We subject our reasoning to appetites and emotions. We're going to go off course. We're going to live not a life that is focused on stability and virtue and the good, but is pulled into the sensory world of matter and multiplicity. And we're going to be pulled here, there, and everywhere, constantly distracted and harried and never fulfilled. So roughly that is kind of Plato's schema of the soul and sort of his advice on living the good life. I'm kind of giving you a very crude idea of this. It's probably a lot more complex than that. But so let's now consider, is Plato right? How is his psychology helpful? Well, I think he offers us a vision of the psyche which is not based in the mind simply as a material thing, which is the preoccupation of modern psychology. There are some aspects of modern psychology that go beyond the idea of the mind as simply a material thing, but very often we have the mind based on this idea that you have psychology, which is based on biology, which is based on chemistry, which is based on physics, this kind of reductive approach. And Plato says, well, no, not really. The mind is actually originating from the good and from the one. It's you can't reduce it to that. The mental is more primary than the material. And I think that's a view which is gaining a lot of ground in the philosophy of mind, and hopefully psychology will catch up. But if you go to people, and I've got another video on this called Don Hoffman, Is Reality Made of Conscious Agents? If you look at Don Hoffman's work, for example, he's a cognitive scientist from UCL Irvine in California. He's doing work with physicists and cognitive scientists, mathematicians, modeling a view of our experience as conscious agents based on the idea that consciousness might be primary. And it's got some fascinating ideas that actually is very consistent with Plato's thinking, suggesting that reality is based in a field of consciousness in which you have then these kind of subdivided out conscious forms, if you like, or conscious agents that add into the greater whole or come out of the greater whole, which is itself infinite. That dovetails really neatly in many respects with Plato's forms fitting into and originating from the one. In fact, even Don Hoffman refers to the greater consciousness overall as the one. Slight differences in between him and Plato's thinking, but really interesting that that's going in that direction. And I should note as well, some of the physicists that Hoffman works with are suggesting now that space-time, the world of physics that we see, the material world, is not fundamental. But I won't go off down that rabbit hole too far, but simply to point out that although Plato may seem quite wacky to us in many ways, his scheme of the world is upside down to the way we have been brought up to see the world. Actually, if you go to the cutting edges of physics and philosophy of mind, actually, Plato may well be right. I think there are questions to ask about Plato's idea of the soul. So he sees the soul in some respects as a simplicity, but then he also sees it as made of parts. But he also sees the soul, if you like, as something that passes on beyond death. That is me. But the me that I am is also shaped by the body. So the question then becomes, if I leave the body at death, what is it that actually passes on? Because surely, on his thinking at least, the body is part of what I am. So what actually goes on? Plato doesn't really address those questions. So let's just wrap things up with the pros and cons, as I see them, of Plato's psychology and having kind of psychotherapy with Plato. I think he does offer us a broader, more meaningful connection of the psyche with overall reality. Now, whether or not we agree with exactly how he passes out that reality is kind of by the by. I think it is useful for psychology to reconsider, as I was saying a moment ago, where the psyche fits in the greater scheme of being. The models we have at the moment, I think, leave us kind of as cut off accidents within the physical world. And I think that has consequences in terms of, particularly for a bit of a thinking person, in terms of how you see yourself. It's a lot less hopeful, let's say. He also offers us the idea of immortality. Now, he's not very clear on that, I don't think, but the very possibility that we're part of a greater consciousness, that something goes on beyond death, is a hopeful thought. That not everything that we're about now just comes to an end. I think also Plato advances psychology from where things were at amongst his predecessors. So there were already ideas that the psyche is kind of informing the individual. We breathe in psyche. If you see my last video on the more ancient Greek thinkers of psychology, but Plato adds in the cognitive element a lot more clearly, and he also then gives us a really good framework for self-understanding, brings in this idea that we experience these conflicts between the rational mind and our emotions and desires and the appetites. And if you're a psychotherapist watching this, for example, you'll be very familiar with people coming into the therapy room having all sorts of conflicts between, their bodily appetites and desires and their emotions, and what they, at another level, know kind of makes sense in terms of the direction their life should be traveling in, all the sorts of addictions that people have, etc., etc., or the emotional complications they have and the clashes between what they think makes more sense in the longer run and how they feel. But I think Plato, let's come to the cons now. I think what Plato doesn't offer us is a more consistent and coherent psychology. So it's not thoroughly thought out. He, with his 3-part soul, we might ask the question, well, why only 3 parts? If I look at, just take, one of those 3, the emotions are made up of a whole, almost like color wheel of different emotional experiences: guilt, sadness, joy. But you simply don't just have those. You have like a mix of, say, guilt and sadness and joy. You can have more than one emotion at the same time. And Plato doesn't really give any consideration to conflicts beyond just conflicts between reason, emotion, and appetite. He doesn't acknowledge that very often what we experience are conflicts between one of those parts. So I will experience conflicts in between emotions. I might feel joy in a relationship, but I might also experience sadness in a relationship. And how do I resolve those? And that is the bread and butter very often of what psychotherapists will be dealing with. No thinking really on that from Plato. And he doesn't address the idea that there might be conflicts within the rational mind. So it's not like the rational mind is simply just this chariot driver that just knows exactly the course of the good life that should be traveled, and it's just got to steer the emotions and the appetites in the right direction. Sometimes it's just not obvious what the rational good choice to make is. I mean, let's give a concrete example. Let's say I'm in Holland in the 1940s under Nazi occupation. Think of Anne Frank or whoever. Is the good thing to do to join the resistance and fight the Nazis? Yeah, maybe in the longer run that's a greater good. But if it comes at the cost of my family being captured and executed as the price for that, is it clearly the good thing to do? Aristotle takes up this in greater complexity and gives much clearer thought, I think, on choosing and what the virtuous life might look like. But Plato doesn't really go there. So it's not simply a case of the chariot driver knowing the good and heading towards it. And I think Plato would benefit from giving that greater thought. Other things to consider, I guess, are that he doesn't always, he tends to play down the role of the body. So the body is in, this kind of prison that the soul is in, and that possibly abstracts the human life to some extent out of the material world. Whether or not we think the material world is ultimately real, we still live this sort of embodied life. And it just raises the question, actually, is the body quite as bad as Plato suggests? And yeah, he wants to say it's probably okay when it's ordered correctly under reason and emotions, and then we give attention to the appetites. But are the human appetites as bad as he might be suggesting? And does that lead us, as we go down through the history of psychology or the history of spirituality as well into an unhealthy dichotomy between higher and lower things in the human experience, human life. And the body might actually contain some wisdom that needs to be listened to. But I think I take his point overall that perhaps overall, if we put too much stress on bodily needs and overemphasize and overweight ourselves towards the body's appetites, we are asking for problems. I mean, if I think we're currently, apologies if you're watching this in a few years' time, hopefully it won't be ongoing, but we're right in the middle of the Palestine-Israel conflict at the moment. Here we can see an example of people on both sides where longer-term reason is not really governing the good of all and the good of many, is not really governing over the emotions or the appetites. So there's this, desire to get land. There's this desire to just listen to one's own rage. And it's not really, reason kind of many senses goes out the window. And so we can see it at a society level, an international level, these kind of patterns going on, but we can also see that in our own lives and we get things out of order. So broadly, I guess we could say Plato's got some wisdom there to offer us. However, if I'd had my session with Plato, I paid up for him for a psychotherapy session, I'm not sure that I would want to come back to Plato in the long term. He's useful for perhaps getting some existential perspectives on where my soul sits in the scheme of reality, but I think I'd want to get back in my time machine and visit some other people. And as part of this series, that's what we're going to do. We're going to travel in our time machine, hopefully have a session on Aristotle's couch and a session on other great thinkers through history, and the insights and benefits they might give to us in terms of how do we live a well-ordered and a good life. Thanks for listening. I'm really pleased, would ask you to subscribe because it does help us with the old YouTube algorithm. Please put a like and a comment. I generally have a bit of a discussion with people if they put comments in there, and that really does help us to get this channel noticed on the old YouTube algorithm. So thanks for listening and good luck with living your well-ordered and thriving life.